Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, welcome to the Norwegian Nobel Institute. This is a special day for us, not only since we are opening today the research seminar for this season, this semester, but also since we are launching our new public lecture series. It has been an ambition for the Norwegian Nobel Institute since its establishment to reach out to the broader audience and to inspire a public debate on questions on peace, war, conflict in Norway and even internationally. So this event will be streamed, so it can also be accessed from abroad, and I can tell you that a similar lecture last year with Nigel Ferguson has so far been seen by 10,000 people on the internet, streamed here from this room. The overarching theme of this public lecture program is the age of liberal internationalism. And as you know, as a school of foreign policy thinking, liberal internationalism carries with it two key legacies. The first is the pacification of foreign relations among liberal states, to many of you known as democratic peace. The scope and scale of interstate conflict has decreased. Peaceful restraint appears to be most effective in the relations among liberal states. Liberal states, however, have fought numerous wars with non-liberal states. In addition to the democratic peace, liberalism also carries with it a second legacy, sometimes called Western hubris, or referred to as Western hubris. It has been associated in recent years by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So for many, the doctrine has become synonymous with an urge to intervene in faraway places. To look into this legacy, we have invited leading international and Norwegian historians, economists, and political scientists. And this will offer an opportunity to discuss how liberal internationalism has transformed international relations and what patterns of continuity and change are apparent. And as you can see from our full program, we have invited 10 leading foreign policy scholars to address various aspects of this problem. It is our hope that this will be a contribution to the Norwegian and also the international foreign policy discourse. Since I will have to excuse myself and leave earlier for another meeting, we have asked Hilde Restad, assistant professor at Bjørknes College, to serve as moderator after this lecture. But first of all, I am glad to introduce our first speaker in this new program, the research director of this institute, Asje Toje. I used to look upon him as young and promising. I still look upon him as young, quite young. He is definitely not only promising anymore. He has put his mark on Norwegian discourse and international discourse on these and other topics in the last few years, as you all know. So we are glad to invite you here to the stage, Asje. And your topic is, I will not put it wrong, Europe and the age of liberal internationalism. Please welcome Asje.
Kjære venner, jeg får ta på meg det litt selvbevisste ansiktsuttrykket vi nordmenn tar på oss når vi skal snakke utenlandsk. Today you will be part of something new, not something essentially new. After all, we have had public lectures here at the Nobel Institute for a long time, going back all the way till the earliest years of the 1900s. The new aspect is that we have taken our annual research seminar and taken it from being an essentially academic discussion forum and opening it up for a more general audience. And that, my friends, that's you. The format for today's talk is that the speaker will have the floor for 45 minutes. We will then have a 15-minute break before rejoining for questions and answers. Please keep in mind that there are no stupid questions. If you wonder about something, there is a good chance that somebody else in the audience might be wondering about the same thing. Don't be shy. We have a microphone that will be passed around in the audience then, but I have to give you an early warning. In order to keep things organized, Hilde Restad will be in charge of the Q&A, so if you want to have pose a question, please indicate it to Professor Restad. And in terms of timing, a good rule of thumb will be that if 3 minutes have passed and you're still talking, it might be a good idea to skip forward to the next sentence that ends with a question mark and then stop. My task today, dear friends, is to stretch out the canvas that the lectures that will follow will give greater detail to. Liberal internationalism is used in the seminar series as a gathering point or as a conceptual lens through which to approach some key developments in international affairs in the years that have passed since the end of the Cold War. There is no canonical description of liberalism. What we tend to call liberal resembles a family portrait of principles and institutions recognizable by certain characteristics. For example, a commitment to individual freedom, government through democratic representation, rights of private property, and the equality of opportunity. These are aspects that most liberal states share, although none of them have perfected them all. Joseph Schumpeter saw the interaction of capitalism and democracy as the foundation of liberal internationalism. We will hear more about this from the absolute leading international expert in the field, Michael C. Doyle. He will be here at the Nobel Institute on June 12th. I will offer my own definition a little later in my talk. The 25 years that span the end of the Cold War to our present days has been determined by economic expansion, the emergence of a global trading place to which all but a few states are part. While world average GDP per capita stood at around $1,000 in year 1900, it has jumped to around 6,000 today. This is all the more notable because of a differing trend. We have also seen a rapid growth in population. The world population has increased sevenfold from year 1800 to today. And today, the number of people living on this globe is 7,238,774,501, according to the World Population Clock of the US Census Bureau. And in line with the growth in population, our ingenuity has increased. Technology has advanced in leaps and bounds. The same species that took 1,500 years to grow from bronze tools to iron tools and used 7 decades has only used 7 decades from the emergence of the very first computers to the cellular phones that you have in your pockets now. Perhaps we have even become more peaceful. Violence is, according to the Harvard scholar Steven Pinker, becoming less common. And this is in all aspects of violence, ranging from corporal punishment of children to the abuse of women and even war. Pinker has shown in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that the level of violence after World War II has been rapidly declining, adjusted for population growth. He thinks he sees a humanitarian revolution that has increased, and I quote, a marketplace of ideas where liberal humanism could emerge. He concludes, and I quote, the world has never been a better place. So let's keep that in mind if I get a little bit more negative as my talk progresses. This trend has been matched by a great expansion of international cooperation and a quest for supranational solutions to international problems. According to the Union of International Organizations, there are, wait for it, 65,000 international organizations in the world today, spanning from the large-scale government organizations to the plethora of NGOs and transnational firms to the one-man Mongo. I love this term. It's an abbreviation for my own NGO. And it's a term that I associate with the Dutch scholar Linda Holman. It should be noted that even if the world has avoided great power contest of the sort that historically has cost the most lives, these have not been Pacific times, which I will return to in the following. Neither have they been times of disarmament. According to the CIPRI yearbook, there was a 45% rise in global defense expenditure in the years 1998 to 2008. The United States, China, India, and Russia were among the big spenders, while Europe saw a slight decline in this defense spending. So, in sum, poverty and oppression has been on the wane in the world. Liberal policies seem to be a common denominator for these positive trends. On September 6th, in the year 2000, liberal internationalism stood in its zenith. That day, world leaders met in New York to the largest summit in world history. It was a magnificent sight. Kings, presidents, dictators, and prime ministers, all in their charcoal suits, met in the UN General Assembly while New York skyscrapers lit up to spell the words UN 2000 along their facades. The meeting ended with 100 heads of state signing the ambitious targets for the world's future. The Millennium Development Goals aimed to eradicate global poverty. The ethos was liberal and from on high. This was not coincidental. Accompanied by a dramatic fall in the number of wars and a rapid increase in free trade, the world had seen a rapid growth in the number of democracies in the world in the 1990s. It is one of history's paradoxes that a regime often expresses itself in its greatest splendor and arrogance at the moment when the seeds to its defeat has already taken hold. This is not my point. I borrow this from Reinhold Niebuhr, the great theorist. It is unlikely that the world would be able to agree to a similar document to the Millennium Goals today. The UN is currently a shadow of its former self. Free trade is under pressure. The one-size-fits-all regime of the World Trade Organization is being challenged by a spaghetti ball of bilateral trade agreements. A similar bilateralization is underway in security politics. More about that when the Norwegian expert panel, which I'm part of, will deliver its defense report in this room this coming Tuesday. The conflicts along Russia's border zone denotes something bigger than some single provinces changing owner. It signals a dramatic weakening of liberal internationalism in international affairs. Anne-Marie Le Glouanec and Adrian Popp will address this question in terms of geopolitical rivalry between the West and Russia, but also in terms of economic interdependence in the former Soviet sphere. You will find the seminar plan on the table to the right of the exit. One of the notable aspects of the current tensions between Russia and the West is what a poor job Western analysts and political leaders have done of understanding Russian foreign policy. We utterly failed to predict the Russo-Ukrainian conflict and have repeatedly underestimated both Putin's willingness to defy cherished norms, at least to the West, and on the road to his long-term project of reclaiming Russia's great power status at Western expense. Walter Russell Mead, the American foreign policy analyst and professor of political science, recently stated, "From a Western point of view, Putin has been so weakened by the oil crash and Western sanctions that the only thing that remains is to negotiate his surrender. The West keeps hinting that it will offer easy terms, if asked. But Putin keeps blowing past every off-ramp that the Europeans and Americans can build." I think this is a good description. The trouble is that the contemporary Western mind has a hard time grasping a basic insight, and that is, we are not the world, and Russia is not us. Mead points to three tenets to which, according to him, most Western policy elites agree. The first is that the rise of liberal capitalist and more or less democratic and law-based international order is both unavoidable and irreversible. The second is that the so-called Davos elite, the financiers, the politicians, the intellectuals, the journalists, the technocrats who manage the great enterprises, institutions, and politics of the contemporary world, that all these people actually know what they are doing and that they are competent to manage the system they represent. The third is that no serious alternative to the Davos perspective really exists. Our establishment believes in its gut, this is according to Mead, that Davos has and always will have both might and right on its side. This self-confidence is, of course, not historically new. And this is a rather American perspective, if I may say so, which sees liberal internationalism as a continuation of American exceptionalism. This is the topic of Hilde Eliassen Restad's lecture this coming Thursday on April 30th. The role that the United States has had in determining the liberal order, of course, goes back much further than the 1990s. The professors David Snyder and David Ekblad will give lectures on the one hand on American exceptionalism and internationalism, but also on European experiences with the same in the period leading up to World War II and the years immediately after. Let me say that historical parallels are very often unhelpful. Those who use them very often have a world history that is very short or very narrow. One sometimes gets a sense that everything worth mentioning happened in the years from 1933 to 1949. Yet, there are many systemic similarities between our present times and the international system in place when Alfred Nobel wrote his will, i.e. in the 1890s and in the 1990s, which might merit a closer exploration. First of all, these were ages of technological revolution, of economic growth, and of financial expansion. As a result, these are periods marked by a high density of interaction. It is hardly a coincidence that observers in both ages used the same buzzwords to characterize the world they saw. For example, interdependence. The term, as far as I can see, was first used by George Lorimer in 1877 and was later popularized by Norman Angell, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he used it in 1910. Closely related to this was that the 1890s and 1990s were ages of liberal rhetoric. There is a praise of free enterprise and of unadulterated free market theory. There is also the praise of democratic government and of human dignity, and the effort on the part of the Western powers to export their system of governance, including by military means, as seen in the 1890s in the scramble for Africa. And this vocabulary was present at the preeminent powers of that age, by Great Britain and by the United States. And we see the same in the 1990s. These values were expressed, not coincidentally, by very self-conscious governments who were aware of their status as preeminent powers and by their opportunity to shape the world in their image. Many students of international systems would, in hindsight, consider that Britain and the United States had reached the peak of their preeminence during the 1890s and the 1990s, respectively. That is to say that they were the hegemons of their day. For Britain, that period ended with World War I. That is not to say, dear friends, that the current travails that liberal internationalism is facing will necessarily lead to conflict and war, only that it once did. But of course, the international system is qualitatively different today. In 1992, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book that had tremendous influence. In the End of History and the Last Man, he argues that the end of the Cold War would imply that the Western liberal democracy would make our form of government to history's ultimate form of governance. Countries of the world could, would, and should become liberal democracies. This thought stuck, also amongst those who denounced it. The two decades that followed was marked by an astonishing assertiveness amongst Western countries. Europe and America began to require that states everywhere should adhere to liberal values as the West defined them. One of the most notable developments was the rise of human rights as a reference point in international politics. We're very honored to have Harvard professor Samuel Moyn come address our audience on this on May 28th. We also got into the habit of intervening in other states' internal affairs in order to promote such objectives. Liberal states are, as Ola Njølstad pointed out, not always very liberal when dealing with non-liberal states. Norrin Ripsman will talk about this here on May 7th, illiberal liberalism. To my mind, and here we come to the definition of liberal internationalism. To my mind, liberal internationalism as a foreign policy doctrine has 4 cornerstones. The first is the belief that, and this is a little bit complicated, so prick up your ears, the belief that democracy, market economy, the rule of law, and human rights are so sticky that if one state accepts one of them, the other 3 will surely follow. This would lead to liberal democracy as the world's preferred form of government. The second is the idea of economic interdependence as a key to economic growth and peace. Globalization would make borders less relevant and necessitate supranational governance. This assumption was based on the fact that democracies rarely go to war against other democracies, what Olav Njølstad, the director, called democratic peace. A third factor was technology optimism, i.e., the belief that new technology would solve challenges as they arise. Let's keep in mind, these were the years of the internet revolution, which promoted prosperity, openness, and innovation on a scale that had not been seen since the Industrial Revolution of the late 1800s. The fourth idea, a kind of an insurance policy, if you will, was the certainty that an extremely powerful United States stood ready to enforce the liberal order should need arise. Internationalists share a belief in supranational solutions to humanity's challenges, while supporters see a higher form of rationality, a kind of realistic idealism. Opponents argue that this is a Western model of society that is being forwarded, meaning that globalization is another word for Westernization. And this is, of course, something that is becoming ever more explicit in the policy doctrines of countries such as Russia and China. In the liberal decade that started in the mid-1990s, was characterized by foreign policy activism. Western leaders went to work to fulfill their own prophecy of a liberal world. Their instruments were ranging from foreign aid to diplomacy and, in a few select cases, military force. During the Kosovo intervention of 1999, British Prime Minister Tony Blair declared with confidence that we are all internationalists now. Very few contradicted him in this, because the hubris seemed justified. The dream of a rational world order governed by abstract principles and managed through supranational institutions was consistent with facts on the ground. When Tony Blair left power in 2007, liberal internationalism was already in retreat. A key reason for this was the ill-fated interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in Libya. We are very honored to have one of the world's absolute leading experts on the Middle East, William B. Quandt, who will come to address us on this on June the 11th. I'm not going to steal his thunder, but I think one of the conclusions that we might share is that the West has struggled to translate interventionism into functioning states. From Africa's aid-dependent client states to Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and no single incident did more to weaken the internationalists' self-esteem than the Iraq invasion of 2003 and the Afghan mission that has been wound down now in 2015. As a consequence, as we stand here today, the prestige of liberal internationalism has been greatly reduced, albeit from perhaps a somewhat too high summit. But what about Europe? European integration has been a post-child of international liberalism, with states of this war-torn continent putting their differences and sovereignties aside to engage in deep cooperation and supranational governance. Yet, European power has, as The Economist recently put it, disappeared down the rabbit hole of European integration. It is noteworthy how difficult the Europeans find it to agree on any single policy question high on the international agenda today. And that spans from everything from global trade and the trade agreement with the United States to the refugee crisis in Southern Europe and the crisis in Ukraine. America, still the leading superpower, seems incapable of preventing geopolitics from moving in an unwanted direction, seen from an American perspective. Gideon Rachman, the editor of the Financial Times, a former visiting fellow at the Nobel Institute in 2013, explained this shift with something that is very difficult to pin down for us scholars. He points to a shift in attitude amongst global leaders. Rachman believes that the economic crisis that started in 2008, ongoing, has changed the dynamics of international politics. And I quote him, "In a new economic reality, the win-win logic that allowed the world to embrace globalization has been replaced by a zero-sum thinking, where one state's progress is regarded as another's loss." The aforementioned assumptions have come under pressure. The hypothesis that all countries necessarily will become liberal democracies seems to be weakened. We have seen a growth in the number of illiberal democracies, such as Russia. The blessings of economic interdependence has also shown its dark side when the Western powers attempted to agree on sanctions against Russia in the wake of the crisis in Ukraine. Everybody agreed that they wanted sanctions, but nobody wanted to bear the costs. The technological revolution no longer appears to be some panacea. The theory of democratic peace also seems less certain given the nominally democratic assumed Russia and its behavior towards the equally nominally democratic Ukraine. And finally, the belief in American superiority seems more uncertain at a time when the United States seems less willing to balance and to enforce the international order. The conflicts in the fracture zones between East and West are basically about whether we should have one international system or several. The new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is by many seen as a direct rival to the IMF, that child of Bretton Woods, where the United States and the Western powers came together in the aftermath of World War II to give the world some of the key institutions that we've had up to this date. And now we see the Chinese being willing to challenge this also on an economic level. At the same time, if Russia manages to establish its own sphere of influence and to resist Western pressure, this will indicate that we now live in a multipolar world. For reference, I'm not amongst those who believe that the world is multipolar yet. I still defer to the United States being so much more powerful economically, militarily, you name it, that it makes very little sense to talk of any parity with actors such as India, China, Brazil, or Russia. were the Russians to be able to establish a sphere of influence along in the former Soviet sphere, this will present an acute challenge for the internationalists' claim that their ideas are universal. The signal Moscow sends to the 14 former Soviet republics is: the West is far away, while Russia is close, and you will have to deal with us. In the media chaos during the Crimean crisis, reality went from black and white and soon became murky shades of grey. Soldiers that Russia sent to Crimea without military or national insignia were mixed with volunteers from all over the Russian-speaking world. And later, the referendum, which was organized to justify what became the annexation of Crimea, left an impression that the transfer was in line with the popular will. Western insistence on Ukraine's inviolable sovereignty did sound a little hollow, at least since under the doctrine of liberal internationalism, the West had broken with this principle on numerous occasions. In a way, one might say that Kosovo, Tony Blair's war, was the original sin in this regard. The West attacked Serbia without a UN Security Council mandate. Russia renounced this in furious terms in 1999, but this did not stop them from using this example to legitimize their own interventions in the years that followed, most recently in Ukraine. Russia, or perhaps President Putin, sees Western norms as a Trojan horse for the expansion of Western power at their expense. In the war of words that followed after the annexation, Russia used the internationalists' own vocabulary. The use of military force was presented as a humanitarian intervention to protect Crimean citizens from genocide. And they even referred to the liberal responsibility to protect doctrine that had been tried out for the first time against Libya by NATO in 2011. Now the R2P doctrine was performed with a Russian accent and without a UN Security Council mandate. And suddenly a lot of Western powers saw the principal problems with this doctrine. And that is, of course, that it can open for powerful states to take advantage of their asymmetry and use force against weaker states claiming to be on some moral mission. A new order, a new world order is taking shape. And it's too early to say to what extent it will resemble the 2 decades that now lies behind us. What I will say is that in the time to come, we will likely see fewer ill-fated interventions, but it might also mean fewer Millennium Goals, the latter which I believe will stand as perhaps our generation's finest hour. The decline of liberal internationalism places a burden on Europe, particularly the region that arguably most wholeheartedly embraced the new gospel. We are seeing signs of creeping renationalization within the EU, with member states clawing back authority that they had handed over to Brussels. At the same time, Russia is actively engaging in public diplomacy, which is much more effective than most Norwegian commentators tend to understand. The 50 years of cohabitation has left a deeper understanding of Russian logic and motives in the countries that were in the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. And it is quite apparent that Russian tactics towards dividing Europe is ongoing, and it's going to be interesting to see how long the sanctions will remain in place. At the same time, the absence of economic growth has introduced an element of scarcity that has altered both the priorities and also the national policies of the European states' leaders. So, the biggie. Will the whole thing come crashing down? Will the age of liberal internationalism end the same way that it did with the First World War? Jürgen Habermas has warned against this. I think not. G. John Eikenberry, one of our former visiting fellows, has pointed out time and time again, perhaps a little bit too many times, that the fact that the current order delivers so many goods to so many actors, and that this fact helps to insulate it from the sort of broad, cataclysmic regime change that we have seen for historical orders in the past. That is, of course, not to say that it will remain the same. We are living in a world that is less Western. As Fareed Zakaria pointed out in the book The Post-American World, the tallest buildings, the biggest dams, the largest selling movies, and the most advanced cell phones are all being made outside the West. The question is not whether the new actors, the Indias and the Chinas of this world, will have their say, but whether the current order will be flexible enough to accommodate their rise. On this question, the jury is still out. Thank you very much for your attention. We will now adjourn for 15 minutes and then reconvene for questions and answers. Thank you.
Louise Nichols-Smith, and I'm a layman. I'm here, I'm not a political social scientist. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you.
Okay. I stusset litt, that's Norwegian, but I was wondering a little bit about what you were saying about the US supremacy at the end there. It's not my view of the world, and I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, as we all know, the end of the Second World War ended, above all, with an American victory. For the longest time, we had a tendency to assume some sort of parity between the Soviet Union and the United States. During the time of the missile counters back in the 1980s, American political scientists tended to assume that the Soviet economy was roughly half of that of the United States, while in fact we know now it was on par with Italy. And after the end of the Cold War, Paul Kennedy and others assumed that the United States would follow suit and decline like the Soviet Union had done. But on the contrary, the United States embarked on a period of, I would say, unprecedented, but it's not, but rapid economic growth under the presidencies of Bill Clinton. In that time, the order that is sometimes referred to as unilateralism, sometimes referred to as Pax Americana, emerged, and the United States became the global leader. And to my mind, it still is. The United States is, in the words of Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, the indispensable nation, the state that has to agree if international agreements are to have force. Of course, the role of the United States is not as prevalent as it was at the height of the post-Cold War era in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And the United States is finding it very difficult to deal with this accompanied decline in influence. The Americans are baffled that the Russians are not listening to them, as I said with the off-ramps, that they have been signaling that we will offer easy peace terms if you just come to your senses, as we define it, and Putin just won't listen. And he has defined his project explicitly in opposition to this concept of a unilateral, a unipolar system led by the United States. And I think this is quite an important point, and one that is often missed in the West. When we're talking about sanctions against Russia and protesting Russia's behavior in Ukraine, a lot of other countries in the world are conspicuously quiet. I'm talking about China, India, Brazil, South Africa. It has been the West that has been the most shocked by Russia's behavior, whilst a lot of the other countries seem to be thinking that the world is changing and we will have to just get used to that. A lot of these countries have perhaps similar aspirations in their own near abroad. So for the United States, it finds itself in quite a difficult situation, I would say, where it is on the one hand a system maintaining power, the power that maintains the current liberal order and that other states look to do so, while at the same time seeing that it's being challenged by other powers and actors. E.H. Carr and Robert Gilpin, both theorists, have written about this situation and why it is perilous in international systems. Because what happens when the established powers, the system maintaining powers, see that in the system new powers are rising. The system has allowed other powers to rise, while at the same time the rising powers are protesting that the international structures in place are created in order to prolong the dominance of the established powers. And this is very much the image that we see. China, Russia, India. Why is there no place at the UN Security Council for India? Just one example. And in this situation, we could end up in a very dangerous corner. Robert Gilpin has described it as a situation where the established powers are weakened in their determination to uphold the rules of the system, while at the same time the emerging powers don't see themselves as system-maintaining powers because they believe that this is a system that is catering to somebody else than themselves. And if you were to take a very unfriendly reading of the policies of Barack Obama, and of course Hilde Restad will give greater insights to this in her talk, if you were to look on Barack Obama with unfriendly eyes, one could perhaps see a lessened will on behalf of the United States to be the janitor and the policeman of the international system, because this is a system that doesn't have a police authority. And when the Iraqs of this world occupies the Kuwaits of this world, it will be down to the United States to act. When we see the Russian annexation of Crimea, one of the notable facts is that everybody has agreed, it seems, that Russia will keep the annexed province. Even, when we're talking about, coming to an arrangement with Putin, nobody in the West are saying that they will have to withdraw from the territory that, in fairness, they signed off on was Ukrainian territory and a country whose territorial integrity they would respect. They didn't. And also, when you see the rise of this Chinese Development Bank, it's not only Asian countries or the usual suspects that have signed up to it. No! Also Britain and France has signed up to it, even if the United States has signaled to its close allies, don't do this. This will help erode the international system. This will undermine the IMF. No, no, no. They have still signed up to it. And that might be an indicator of a world where the United States carries less sway And that is bound to be very, very traumatic for our American friends, because American exceptionalism is deeply ingrained in American foreign policy. This, this bumper car sticker, America #1, is something that is held very close to the heart of most Americans. And the Americans are, I probably shouldn't say this, but Americans are very bad at cooperating with anybody on equal terms. I think British prime ministers, French presidents, and Russian presidents, Chinese party leaders, they've all found out the same thing, that when they come to Washington, they all come with the ambition of being treated as an equal, only to find out that the United States treats no one as an equal because they don't view anybody else as their equal. And of course, with some justice, given that the United States is much more powerful on pretty much any indicator than its nearest competitor. That makes it more difficult for the United States to deal with a relative decline in power in the international system. And the worst case scenario is, of course, that we have a system left without, a policeman and a janitor, and that might lead countries, especially middle powers, such as Iran, to engage in policies that they otherwise would not have dared to do. And we see some examples of that. For instance, the jockeying between Saudi Arabia and Iran over the intervention in Yemen, currently ongoing, while the bombing stopped yesterday, might be one example or a prelude to things to come. Did that answer your question?
We have one in France. Pia is
Thanks. Pia Isakser, political scientist, mainly with a military background. I've mainly worked on representing Norwegian interest in NATO, the UN, and the EU. These two memberships, the UN and NATO, and also all the association agreements we have with the EU, takes up tremendous amounts of time and money, and just attending meetings cost a fortune. I know, because I've been working in the Ministry of Defense and also the defense stuff. And I am very critical to Norwegian membership of any other organizations than these in the area of security. In 2008-09, I myself pulled the sword on and closed down the UN organization Sherbrig, because all we did was talk at different venues. Something which could have made sense if I was there as a diplomat. But I was there as Norway's force generator, and my boss, General Diesen, and I both agreed that we had no military forces to offer to Sherbrig, because we have NATO as priority 1, we have the UN as priority 2, and then if it's anything left, we offered it to the European Union, and then we had nothing for Sherbrig. And at the same time, I do see now, as General Mood have reported from Brussels, that more Nordic defense cooperation in practice could be the answer to some of our challenges in the north. I do appreciate this, but would wish that this cooperation took place within the established framework of NATO and not within NORDEFCO. Do you think that there is any hope that Sweden and Finland could join us in NATO? I do know that my former teacher, Alex Stubb, is pro-NATO, but I guess he is no longer Prime Minister of Finland after last weekend's elections. Do you think Sweden and Finland let themselves be bullied by Russia not to join us in NATO? Thanks.
Well, it's a big question, and it touches more on the work that I've been doing for the Defense Minister's expert panel on crisis and war than it does on the topic of this talk. But I'll answer it. The United Nations. It's a magnificent thing, and it's a horrible thing. I must say, this is my personal experience. The United Nations have some of the most brilliant minds, hard-working people that you will meet in any international organization. They also have some of the laziest bastards you will have the misfortune of encountering. And this is kind of the problem with the UN. This tendency to be overstaffed, this great focus on quotas, of national quotas of diplomats, and the mechanisms of meritocracy that don't always seem to work. Some agencies are very good, others are less so, unfortunately. When it comes to Norwegian defense posture, I think that there is a bipartisan consensus on both sides of the aisle in Norway that NATO is the sine qua non of Norwegian security policy. NATO is the bedrock on which we define our own security, and the Article 5 is the core of that. The tendency in Norwegian defense policy has been very similar to many European countries in the 2 decades that have passed, because after the Cold War, a lot of us started thinking new thoughts, and of course we should think new thoughts. The world had changed, and we were examining other ways to organize security. In Norway, this took three courses. One was on the global level, trying to beef up UN forces. One was regional. Perhaps we should look into a Nordic defense union. Why not? Well, anybody could see that it makes sense. There are few states in the world that are more similar than our countries, and we share a lot of the same priorities. And the third was, of course, European Union security and defense policy. Well, for now, it seems that Norwegian willingness to contribute to UN operations has diminished. This is not only because of policies that stem from Oslo, it is also because Norwegian troops are damned expensive. And the UN is now trying to get greater bang for their buck by using forces from countries such as India, even China, and African countries. And they're doing a fine job. Looking at the mission in Congo, this is not the old school type of Lebanon mission with Western soldiers. Most of the soldiers are actually from the region, and I think that's a good thing. When it comes to Nordic defense cooperation, in fairness, to my mind, it's not happening. The Stoltenberg report, sounding out these questions, very appropriately got to the core of the question, and that is the question of collective defense. We cannot venture into binding defense cooperation with these countries unless we see our security as indivisible. And very soon we got a response, first from the Finns, later from the Danes, that is not going to happen. And this kind of leads into the question of NATO membership. It's one of those questions that you could have asked me at any stage since 1949. Every year you may, are they going to join? And the wise money would be on no, I think, if we take history into consideration. In terms of Finland, I think that they feel that their policies towards Russia is more nuanced and sophisticated than the policies of most European countries. They're managing the relationship to Russia, treading a fine line, and it's not the Finlandization of the Cold War, but at the same time, the Finns have invested much in both their diplomatic posture and their defense posture, and it's very different from, for instance, Norwegian defense posture. Take one example, of course, the Finns have they've got landmines all along their borders. In Norway, landmines are banned. They are illegal. We do not have them. And that's kind of one example. In terms of Sweden, nobody knows. I think that Swedish foreign policy has lost much of its predictability over the last years. And sometimes they do very unexpected things. For instance, when they recognize Palestine, that I didn't see that coming. And sometimes they do quite predictable things. For instance, their critique of flogging in Saudi Arabia. Of course, this fitted in very well with a long-standing Swedish foreign policy tradition. Unfortunately, the Saudis didn't really see it that way, and they recalled their ambassador. But the Swedes did as they normally would do. The debate about Swedish NATO membership is one of those things that is very difficult to understand for people who are not Swedish, because the question of NATO membership has taken on a dimension that is tied into the Swedish sense of self, and it goes all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars, and Sweden abdicated from the great power concert, and the need for Sweden to be something more than a small state affiliated to the United States. They see themselves as so much more than that. And this debate is always amusing to watch from afar, but take into consideration that Norway, we have some almost 70 years of experience in being in bed with the Americans. We know the Americans quite well now. We cooperate well with the Americans, and to us it's kind of safe and well known, whilst to the Swedish sometimes it comes across as something dangerous, and that something very important is in the balance, and that something very important might be lost if Sweden was to go down that way. Of course, when we look at why Sweden joined the European Union, they did it amidst the financial crisis, and it's possible that Sweden will join NATO amidst the security crisis. And the way that the Swedish defense posture is currently, such a crisis could arise at any time, because Sweden is militarily very weak and will have great difficulties in responding to any challenges in their near abroad. And that would of course be a shock, as we saw during the submarine scare last year. I think that's everything. Did I answer? Yeah.
Next question is for the gentleman in the black blazer on your right. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Jarle Simensen, History. My compliments on the program, unifying theme, much to look forward to. As to Fukuyama, he was probably less naive than sometimes presented. He was discussing the possibility of setbacks, backlashes, the long time view, especially with regard to Russia. My question concerns the concept of the program, liberal internationalism. You seem to stress the liberal side, the basis in liberal ideas, the aims, the goals, and not so much the internationalism side, if we think of internationalism as somehow backed by international institutions. If you take the latter variation of the concept, the American wars of the last decades are not basically liberal internationalism. They are imperial wars in the traditional manner of America, for that sake. And they are characterized as such by Brzezinski, America's imperial wars, from Vietnam to Iraq. So, used in that sense, Iraq is not an expression of liberal internationalism. It's a failure of liberal internationalism.
Excellent point. I'll just get straight to your main point. I think you are right. When looking back at the justifications that were posted by the Bush government for justifying the war against Saddam Hussein and Iraq, it was quite late in the game that the liberal internationalist logic came to the fore. Unfortunately, the liberal internationalist vocabulary, at least, was very close to the heart of the main salesman of this war, Tony Blair. And I despair for Tony Blair because he was perhaps one of the greatest leaders of Britain after World War II. And still, his reputation has been tarnished by his vocal defense of this war. And to this date, he will still not recognize that this was the wrong war. He still defends the conflict to his own detriment, I would say. Brzezinski refers to the war in Iraq particularly, but I also believe in Afghanistan as imperial wars. Of course, the main difference between the classical imperial war and American conflicts is that the United States has no ambition of taking these countries over. And when looking at the sort of regimes that the United States attempted to assemble first in both Iraq and in Afghanistan, it was obvious that the goal was liberal democracy. Of course, that might have been wrong-headed with the benefit of hindsight, to take a largely tribal society, as in the case of Afghanistan, and assume that liberal politics would have a good breeding ground. I could definitely have a lot of sympathy for your perspective, as I understand it, that liberal internationalism, or at least internationalism, has been somehow hijacked by a policy elite that has harnessed it to their own political project that doesn't really have anything to do with this. It's a justification for something they wanted to do anyway. I think that that might be, well, appropriate. I don't think it would be appropriate in the case of Libya. I really think that the air campaign in Libya was very much brought forth, and also in Kosovo, by liberal internationalist inclinations. And what I said in my lecture is that no single instance has done more to tarnish liberal internationalism than Iraq. Perhaps I should have said that this might be right and it might be wrong, because I do have a lot of sympathy for your argument, and the fact that liberal internationalism in the Iraq war has somehow become inseparable is, I would agree, not as clear as some people tend to assume. And that was quite obvious when you look at the rationale presented by people like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. I don't think anybody would portray these as classical liberal internationalists. On the contrary. When it comes to Fukuyama, he is one of the great scholars of our age. His argument in The End of History and The Last Man was more nuanced than people tend to assume. It was an argument that, unfortunately for him, in its most sort of caricatured version, sailed around the world. It's a concept that's easy to understand, and all the caveats that he presented were of course thrown to the wayside, because it wouldn't be simple if it had caveats. That said, I think that Francis Fukuyama has altered his perspective a lot about the international order. Of course, like a good academician, he doesn't really recognize that he has done so. He wrote an update to The End of History and The Last Man, where he went back on some of the basic claims in this book, but he later reversed these concessions, as I see it. All that said, I think it is astounding that the United States has brought forth another one of these great intellectuals. He's good at economy, he's good at theory, he's good at institutions, and his two new books about the construction and decline of international order is something that I believe belongs in every bookshelf, not just the policy or IR-oriented people. Finally, you asked for the question of institutions in internationalism. This is not just about what states do. I mentioned this briefly, that international affairs have in these years become increasingly institutionalized. It's going to be one of the big stories of the decade to come, to see whether we will see that the institutional frameworks that we have in place, that it will endure, that it will have, it will go up and down, but it will survive, or B, that we will see a new institutions rising and old declining, or C, that we will see a breakout from these international frameworks. In a country like Great Britain, you see an increased willingness to reverse institutional cooperation. And this is mirrored in certain countries, such as Hungary here in Europe. And you see in countries like China, there is a great interest in developing new institutional affiliations. As is the case so often in international affairs, the picture is not clear-cut, and I will not make any predictions about where the world is heading, only to say that the overly optimistic assumptions that we saw during the 1990s, and that was so prevalent in Norwegian academia by the internationalist segment of this assumption of a supranational world, that we would have a world where borders would become less relevant and where the nation state would somehow decline, and that we would see the rise of transnational democracy and multiculturalism and all this. This particular worldview seems a lot less likely today than it did in 1997 or even in 2005.
Okay, we've spent half an hour on 3 questions. So we're going to spend 15 minutes on 4 questions. Challenge accepted. We're going to go to
Thanks so much, Hilde. Thank you, Asje, for a very interesting lecture and great seminar program. First, 2 very short questions. The first is from my good colleague Greg Reichberg at PRIO, who observes that the lecture plan says that Moyne's lecture on the origin of human rights is listed for Friday, 28th of May, but 28th is a Thursday. He says, please request clarification. I guess it's on the Thursday, isn't it? Because all of these are on Thursdays?
Actually, is this the Samuel Moyne?
Yeah.
That's on the Thursday. Yes.
That's on Thursday. Well, very good. Okay, then we'll update, or you'll update the webpage.
I will update the program. Sorry about that.
Brilliant. And number 2, very briefly, to something I know also that Hilde is preoccupied with. When you talk about Americans talking to others and always being the superior, many biographers seem to point out that George Bush Sr. was one of the best at managing to create a sort of even space for speaking about international questions, and much of his success when it comes to, for instance, the first Gulf War comes from the fact that he actually believed in and managed to create a discussion space formed by what, or rather characterized by what he hoped for would be the New World Order. Well, that's a question of history. Brief philosophical comment. I think we must not underestimate what one could see as the ethical drive underlying liberal internationalism, or at least underlying its close cousin, international human rights idealism. And I think it can be summed up in an old legal phrase that we also find in the Universal Declaration that René Cassin was a great champion of, namely acts that shock the conscience of mankind, or acts that outrage the conscience of mankind. I think that sort of formulation betrays the belief that there are certain unideological moral truths. There are certain things that happen in the world that whatever sort of regime you are, these are things that we can come to agree should not happen. And of course, it is not unnatural in the wake of the Second World War that there was this belief that there are certain things that all of us, regardless of what national interests we have, what ideology we say we have, these are things we will react against. And I think that once people or other leaders see this language as actually just a facade, and it really just represents national interests, then you have a real problem. But of course, this is still there. I mean, right now in the debate we are having about the refugees in the Mediterranean, there is this belief of, well, no one can accept this. Everyone must stand up and be against this. And I guess to a certain degree, that's what we think about certain questions of sovereignty too. We cannot just stand there and see them invade this country. So this strong belief that there are certain unideological, underlying moral truths that humankind can gather around, it's still there. I think it's laudable, but I think that it also represents part of the problem, because there is a naivete about that, namely that everyone will come to agree on this. So everyone will think that obviously this is genocide, obviously this is wrongful invasion, obviously this is something we need to do something about. Let us never underestimate at least that part of the picture, the moral beliefs underlying it. Once again, thanks for your great lecture.
Excellent. Was it Bismarck who said there is no such thing as humanity except for the people who purport to speak on behalf of it? This is something that I think Vladimir Putin would nod his head to. This is the way he sees the world. Of course, it's not as simple as either we do something for idealistic reasons, or we do nothing and we listen to the darker angels of our nature, to put that term. For instance, just to be specific, for instance, in the dealings over Obama's threat to bomb to bomb Syria after Assad's regime had broken one of these caveats. You just do not use chemical weapons, and certainly don't use it on your own population. And you most certainly don't use chemical weapons against civilians. This should be one of the sort of red lines of humanity. We should all be able to agree on that, right? Well, Obama thought so. And then Putin says, well, but look at the landscape here. Who are you going to support? Who's going to win this war if you lend your cruise missiles and start carpet bombing the system infrastructure of the Assad regime? And well, we saw later the rise of the Islamic State. This is of course not to say that Putin was right. On the contrary, I think it was a strategy on behalf of the Assad regime to attack the liberal coalition forces while leaving IS in peace, in order to create this perception of crazy rebels that nobody could support. And of course, this is part of the headache of being both an academician and a foreign policy actor. Take Samantha Power. She wrote a book called A Problem from Hell about genocide. Firebrand. Very, very, very moral academician. She's, I think, still the American representative to the UN Security Council. She's one of Obama's people. And even if she has this strong persuasion, exemplified in her own writings, and this strong position that, of course, all of us, we've seen House of Cards, and we will know that the US representative to the UN Security Council is, of course, a very powerful person. Well, not in reality. She has had great problems in furthering her own liberal agenda. And this is where it stands now. I think that there was, perhaps we have to go as far back as George Bush Sr., an emerging consensus about state behavior. What are the boundaries that sovereignty allows? And I think, you will agree with me that George Bush Sr. is in many ways an underrated American president, mainly because he only served one term. He was famous for his ability to get people together and not put the American agenda on the table and ask everybody to agree with it, which has been sort of the trend in some of the presidencies that have followed. What he managed to do with the decline of the Soviet Union and to negotiate the withdrawal of the Soviet Union out of Eastern Europe, and to resist the understandable temptation of capitalizing on the decline of Russia immediately, I think stands to his everlasting, really, credit. Since then, American presidents have, and I think this is a statement of fact, been much less cautious or much less inclined to take Russian considerations into account, especially since the collapse presided over by President Yeltsin. And the pushback that we now see from Putin, and this is in no way to excuse Russia's breaking of international norms and rules, but I do think that the pushback from Putin is to some extent motivated by a frustration of seeing what they believe to be their core national interests not being taken into consideration by the leading power in the international system. In that way, it might be a strength that it's Angela Merkel, a Russian speaker. Of course, Putin is a fluent German speaker. I saw him in the Bundestag, and he charmed them. Strange as it may sound, but he's quite a charming speaker. I think it might be a good idea that it's Angela Merkel who's leading these negotiations. But look at who's involved and who is not. The French are there, and the Germans are there, but the British and the Americans are not there. This might be, a very clever ploy on behalf of the Anglo-Americans, but it might also be a signal from these two countries that they have bigger fish to fry. And that would be a mistake, because as I said initially, the United States, love it or leave it, but it is the indispensable nation. It is the country that has to be at the table, that will have to sign off on the deal if it's going to stick. And that's not a normative statement, that's an empirical statement.
All right. Last three questions, we're going to do them all in a row. The gentleman on the fourth row, below the jacket, and then the gentleman in the white behind him after that. Sorry, I don't know your names yet.
Thank you, Rolf Berg, Minister of Foreign Affairs, retired. Congratulations on a splendid speech, I must say. One question, I should be very short. If you look at the great American president and the great liberal internationalist, President Wilson, when he sent the cavalry into the Sonora Desert in 1911 to chase, Pancho Villa, and when he bombarded the recruits with his navy 1 year afterwards, he said explicitly, and I think it was very well put, I do this in order to teach the Latin Americans to elect good men. Okay, so much for democracy, but that was definitely his message. And my point would be this. If you look at the state of liberal democracy today, with all the challenges, external and internal, and you touch on some of those, of course, you may raise the question, where is liberal democracy heading? Are we filling it too much up with international human rights and other things? Okay, so my question then is, if the liberal democracy would lose further ground and disappear over the horizon, then what is left of our precious liberal international order? Will our precious liberal international order be able to exist as a meaningful expression, as a description of a structure without the existence of, let's say, meaningful liberal democracy? And then again, okay, can we survive? We probably can survive. We managed to survive the breakdown of the first structure of the First World War, and we invented some other nice words. Structures will remain, and there will always be certain institutions which will remain and can do a good job. But again, the main question is, will the present structure be able to exist meaningful without the liberal democracy?
Can you hand the microphone to
Elvis was a journalist and a columnist with some of these papers in Norway sometimes. Please, I'm thinking of using your yardstick and prerequisite. First of all, thank you for the wonderful lecture and the comments from the hall. It's been very enriching. Using your prerequisites and yardstick for liberal internationalism or liberal democracy and the New World Order, and looking at the double standards that are often associated with this interest, in which context do you place Africa in this? And how do you also define the role of China in Africa and how they've been their own order is being accepted? And thank you very much for saying, for also correcting the impression that Putin is not the only one who is not listening to the US, because Britain and France has decided to invest and participate fully in the Asian Development Bank.
Ola Tunander from PRIO also. You describe how the system has changed in recent years, actually, and with much less of a unified understanding of the word. And my understanding is that the Libya war was the final blow, in a way, to this unified hope, in quotation mark, you could say. It's when you speak with the Russians or with the Chinese top people and so on, they say that they actually believed that it would be a negotiated solution to the conflict in Libya after this UN Security Council decision. And then after just hours or a couple of days, the bombing started. And that, I think, changed totally the understanding from the Chinese side, at least, that they thought that you could not trust anything of what is said. And I think that was a major blow to the whole system, actually. Thank you.
Well, I'll respond quickly since we are already on time now. Very, very quickly. Professor Tunander, yes, I think you are very right. Especially not only the Chinese but also President Medvedev felt that he had been fooled by the Western powers when they were given Resolution 1973 in the UN Security Council. The Russians believed that they had signed off on airstrikes to bring hostilities to an end in Misrata. And later, when their campaign was expanded and morphed into system change, this, to the Russian mind, was something that they had been guaranteed was not going to happen, and they felt that they had been tricked. And that is one of the reasons why no such mandates have been given over Syria. Question about where is Africa and China and Africa? Africa is doing just fine. I think the rise of the African Union has been a game changer. I think that the entry of China into Africa, and I know a lot of people in the West are very skeptical of this. I think that competition is helpful. I think that a lot of African countries were left in a very unequal bargaining position where they were having almighty donors on the one hand who had a new idea every 6 months and that they were supposed to live up to. And the arrival of Chinese money with less strings attached has actually helped about economic growth. And let's face it, there's nothing that is better for development than economic growth. And a lot of African countries are doing really well. Some are doing really poorly, but compared to in the past, they're doing quite well. So is liberalism triumphing in Africa? Well, it's 54 countries. In some countries, you see the liberal impulses are very much alive and kicking. And in other countries, you see the African tragedy of one man, one vote, one time, where entrenched elites are as unlikely as ever to give away the power that they were once given. But look, good luck Jonathan. He stepped down in Nigeria. Who would have thought that? There are a lot of positive signs from Africa. I have a lot of hope for the region, especially when it comes to economic development. And finally, Ambassador Berg, President Wilson. You said, you pointed out the importance of teaching the people to elect good leaders. I don't have much hope on that score. For the most part, Western leaders are of the good kind, and they're mostly well-intentioned. Every now and then, some people elect somebody who really should not ever have power. But for the most part, we have mediocre leaders in the West. When you look around, there are very few of the prime ministers and presidents in Europe today that will be remembered beyond our generation. And it will become a little bit like, those things that, do you remember the 1980s, you know, tube socks or something like that? You have to be there in order to appreciate it, and a lot of our prime ministers are like that. And I think that's the kind of leaders that we elect in times of stability. Good thing. We don't really need a Churchill right now. The question about can we survive should the liberal order decline? Of course we can. The world is always falling to pieces, at least for somebody. The world is in a constant process of falling to pieces and being rebuilt. I think Hinduism as a religion has some wonderful images of this rather profound insight. And on that note, I would like to thank you all for coming. And this was only a teaser. This was only the introduction. I hope I will see many of you for the lectures on the Thursdays and the Fridays in the weeks to come. Thank you.